think I was real once until John made me into fiction. After that, I had little choice but to play the parts he fashion did or become a contradiction. I'm Eddie Webb,
And I'm a contradiction.
and today we talk about Mr. Holmes here on Genreless. I don't think I've mentioned it recently, but it's been a few years now, and I still really like our theme song. Still really
I
happy with it.
still I still jazz to it too. It's remarkable. And
Yeah,
you got it off of it was like a no charge for it, right?
it was yeah, I bought a pack of not royalty for it's royalty for music from a humble bundle like 3 or 4 years ago, and it happened to be on there, and I was like, this is nice. And Chris was like, yeah, that sounds good. And then every time I still just bop my head along. It's a really good beat. I like it.
It puts me in the mood to like talk about movies now whenever I hear it. It's almost like a Pavlovian reflex now.
So now every time you're going to watch a movie, just play that little sting before you sit down and watch a movie. And
Yeah. I may try to train other people to do it too.
okay, before you watch a movie, listen to this. Okay, now we're done.
So, Eddie, why did you choose this movie of all movies for us to watch?
A couple of reasons. One is this is another strange spot in Sherlock Holmes, in the sense that a lot of the stuff that was the TV shows that were kicked off in the late 2000s are still ongoing here. So decisions they made before 2010 kind of stick around until this, or they wrap up. Um, and the next kind of big boom of Sherlock Holmes content doesn't quite happen until near the very end of this decade. And I mean, there's a couple of exceptions. One of which is a movie that I shall never watch or review, which is that awful, awful Sherlock Holmes comedy that came out around this time.
What comedy is that? Who would that
I
star, per tell?
don't even want to talk about it. It's that awful. Also, I've forgotten what the movie's called
So,
because I just don't
curiously,
know it.
in the canon, um, how old did Holmes live to be in the canon, Eddie?
Well, actually, that's another reason why I picked this is because I genuinely like this movie. But Holmes, how long he lived is not in the canon. So I have to step back to go into extra canonical texts and which ones are valid and which ones are not. So there was a writer named W.S. Baring Gould who wrote one of the early Sherlockian scholars, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so he was one of the people that there's a lot of the what we call the Great Game in terms of people writing about Sherlock Holmes as if he were real and trying to explain all the contradictions in canon. And in fact, even the term canon comes from these early scholars because one of them was originally an Anglican priest who used Sherlock Holmes as a metaphor for why you should not read biblical texts too literally. And so he jokingly called Sherlock Holmes stuff the canon to refer to the biblical canon, the canonical books of the Bible. And that term stuck, and that's why we have the term canon this day. Um, and so Baring Gould took all the scraps of information about Sherlock Holmes and expanded on them into his biography of Sherlock Holmes, which again treated Sherlock Holmes as if he were a real person, but was actually everything that wasn't the canon. He did his best to try to base it off of logical extrapolations from the canon, but ultimately it was made up. And so he said that Holmes died at the age of 103 in 1957, which does lead to the very weird moments where in DC Comics, Batman and Sherlock Holmes were both alive at the same time and teamed up in one issue.
How was Holmes depicted in that issue?
Actually, he was not that elderly. I think DC didn't quite get the brief on what was supposed to be happening there. He was certainly older, but he was pretty spry for the mid 80s to 90s that he was supposed to be. Whereas this is based off of a novel called A Little Trick of the Mind, which is also a fantastic novel. But to kind of talk about I mentioned before last week that this is the part where Holmes gets not reimagined but reevaluated, right? And so last week we talked about Holmes going back to his roots as more of a adventure story than necessarily purely a mystery character. And we're going to see a steady trend to today where Holmes gets expanded on from that reevaluation. So around this time period, it was also happening in the television shows, particularly the ones where he's reimagined for the modern day, but also in other media as Holmes as actually a character in his own right, which is something we actually don't see very much of. Uh, the only other time it was really attempted was the Somerset Solution in the 70s, and that is, let's say, mixed success. I will say.
That is one of my least favorite Holmes movies.
I've not seen the movie. I read the book, and the book is some. It was a pretty radical departure, but to do so, he had to kind of just literally ignore a chunk of stories. And in the book, even says these stories are just wrong. So it's such. This is Literature of the Mind is more. Let's take Holmes's path through to a longer conclusion and actually look at him as a character and what he goes through, and then use that as a metaphor. So tonally, this movie is very different than everything we've seen. It
Mm-hmm.
very much plays like it is just a pure drama, because it is. It's just a pure drama. Um, but I really enjoy it because it's much like we talked about last week. It's something that tries very hard to stay not pure to the canon, but certainly draws a lot of inspiration from the canon, but is not shackled to it like we saw like in the 60s.
So I had never seen this movie before. This is the
Mm-hmm.
first time I've ever seen it.
Mm-hmm.
So all of my comments and content will come based on that experience.
Yes, I saw it in the theater, and then I saw it once on streaming again soon after that. And then in preparation for this, I said, well, I'm just going to buy the DVD. Like, I didn't even look for streaming options. I just went and bought the DVD because I knew I was going to want to own it because I very much enjoy this movie. It has problems. I'm not going to lie. Most Sherlock Holmes media does. Um, but Ian McKellen, I think, does a really good job with what is intended here, what the brief is, which is to portray an elderly Holmes in a way better way than happens with Christopher Lee.
I don't think anyone briefed Christopher Lee he was supposed to be playing an elderly Holmes.
Right. Although interestingly, uh, we talked before about how RDJ was like, he had the books on set and read from them, and how same thing with in the 80s, Jeremy Brett also very much read this text and knew the text and argued from the text. Ian McKellen did not. Sir Ian McKellen did not do that. Apparently, he did that on Lord of the Rings, and he realized that it was just constantly a distraction. And so he specifically said with this that he was not going to read the text. He went purely by what the director and the script told him to do. So he actually did not research this role.
How do you feel about that?
I see his point. And if this were something closer to the more known parts of Holmes's life, I would have more concern about it. This is, frankly, largely unmapped territory. So how Holmes acts at this stage of his life is largely unclear and certainly has no canonical basis. I mean, he's a beekeeper, stuff like that. That stuff's still accurate. We know about, but beyond that, it's the last canonical reference we have to Holmes is during World War One, and this is right after World War. No, this is right in the middle of World War Two, 47. So it's all made up. So from that perspective, I don't think that researching would have given McKellen that much more to work with.
It's after World War II.
Okay. Yeah, because it's 47. Okay, yes, right, 43, 47. Yes, okay. I thought it was after World War II, but I second guessed myself.
Otherwise, that trip to Japan would have been very difficult too.
That's a fair point, right?
So I will say that I did not see this movie. I didn't watch the trailer, so I went in totally did not know what to expect from the movie.
Mm-hmm.
How having you tell me that Ian McKellen did not research Holmes, that reinforces some of my opinions about this movie, and I don't think that was for me the best choice to portray Holmes with.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because even if this is unmapped territory for Holmes, having read or like studied somewhat of the text would give you an idea of where the character potentially could have gone.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives you something to work with. And to see that, to hear you say that he just did what the director told him also kind of diminishes some of that for me. I
Well, I
want
mean,
actors to act and like make their own decisions, and then the director helps move those decisions towards a larger thing. Just not the director says stage left, and they go, "I will go to stage
no.
left."
To be fair, I think you may miss the part where I said where the director and the script told him. So there are times certainly where he looked at the script, saw the character there, and argued for the character that he saw on the page of the script. So he was still acting from the script. He wasn't just following the director blindly, right? But he did not do the extracurricular research on top of that. Is more what I'm saying. But no, that's a fair point. There are some nods in here which I'll kind of point to as we go through to show that at least a lot of the other team definitely have tried to make sure there are little notes that people who are really strongly in Sherlock Holmes would recognize. Yes, so we also love this stuff and we're faithful to it. But no, this is the point of this movie, and part of the reason why I wanted to talk about it specifically, besides just the fact that I really enjoy it, is that we're now at a point where we can do things with Sherlock Holmes that are pretty heavily distant from the popular culture conception of Sherlock Holmes, but they're never entirely not Sherlock Holmes, right? Like, if you watch this movie, it's pretty clear that this character is intended to be Sherlock Holmes, but it is a very different portrayal of Sherlock Holmes than we've ever seen before, and frankly, may ever see again. Um, Things that are happening around this time, like I already mentioned, but like we already have, there are 3 modern day interpretations of Sherlock Holmes TV series, one in the UK, one in the US, and one in Japan, where
What are
Sherlock
those
Holmes
shows
is a
again?
woman. Sherlock Elementary and Miss Sherlock. I don't mention titles just because most titles some form of Sherlock Holmes, and so it gets confusing when you just mention titles.
True, but for you have a near encyclopedic knowledge of Holmesian lore. And if someone says, I wonder what show Eddie's talking about, I would
Fair.
like to go investigate this. I am here for our common listener, our listener that comes to you, Eddie Webb, for your vast knowledge to rain down on us like blood from the movie Blade.
I was Now I had that scene in my head, so thank you. And that song,
You're
actually.
welcome.
Wow.
You're
Um,
welcome.
uh, but there's also like House, which is a television series right in the 2000s, which was a different modern day interpretation of Sherlock Holmes that went pretty further away from the original material.
Hugh Laurie
Um,
would have been a very interesting Holmes, though.
yeah, I agree, actually. Um, and there's an initial kind of Holmes. I mean, if you watch the first season of House in isolation, you can see more of the Holmes influence. As the
Yeah.
show goes on, it kind of comes its own thing.
Comes more soap
Um,
opera.
yeah, right. And frankly, a less interesting show personally. But uh, we also have there is another anime version that comes out about near the end of the 2010s, which is Sherlock Holmes in a modern day in Japan, but he's homeless, and so his squat is somewhere around 221B in a city in Japan, and he solves
Do
the
you,
crimes.
do you remember what
Um,
it's called?
Not it's 221 something. I don't know off the top of my head actually. I've only watched one episode of it. Um, we also have Moriarty the Patriot, Moriarty the Patriot, which I think just starts 2019, so right near the end of this, which is Sherlock Holmes from Moriarty's perspective. And what if Moriarty was really about trying to overthrow the corrupt aristocracy of the UK, which is wonderful fun. It gets a little. At one point in time, they actually make a James. It's a James, not a James Bond reference. There's like a character that very clearly is intended to be an homage to James Bond in this Victorian setting. It's ridiculous and wonderful. I love it, and it's all about eating the rich, so it's great. Uh, um, but I mean, so and then as we'll see, we'll move into the 2020s. That goes even further, and I'll talk about that when we get there. But
For
um,
me, part of it is you know that I have this thing about media that is its own entity, but to become made or try to gain success, they sort of staple on the name of something else
right,
to make their thing, and that is not related to the name they've generally chosen. So I'm very sensitive to that, and so if I see something that does it, it pings off my radar and has me like immediately in my critic zone, where I'm sitting there, I'm trying to figure out how true it is to the actual character, not necessarily like the text, but the actual character themselves, and if the spirit of that is invested in whatever this thing is that we're doing.
right, right. And I could see why there are a number of people who've watched this and felt a lot like that. It's like, this could have been any movie, and Sherlock Holmes kind of stapled on. I argue that it's an extreme edge case. I feel like certain beats of this movie only make sense if the character is Sherlock Holmes, uh, while recognizing there are entire subplots that could be completely divorced from the fact that this is Sherlock Holmes. So I recognize that chunks of the movie do feel that way, but the whole movie is not. You can excise Sherlock Holmes in the exact same movie. I think that's just not true. Even if you put another character in, that character would be Sherlock Holmes like anyway. So there are some specifics to the character that are necessary here. But I think that to a larger point is what we're really seeing here is that Sherlock Holmes is finally becoming a genre. Hence, one reason why I thought this podcast particular was good to talk about is because there's so much Sherlock Holmes media that you can argue it's a genre just because of its density, but it really takes till the 21st century for that to become literally true. Sherlock Holmes can be in sci-fi. Sherlock Holmes can be in horror. Sherlock Holmes can be in fantasy, and not just a character that's kind of like Sherlock Holmes, but Sherlock Holmes himself can be in these different kinds of genres, and he doesn't. He's not completely unrecognizable if you shift him that far.
I understand what you're saying, and I am still iffy on the movie whether or not it falls within that bucket for me.
Mhm.
Parts of it does, because on one level I understand there's also a deconstruction of the character of Holmes here,
Right.
but by doing that you're also I think there's a way to deconstruct it without destroying the other characters to make your deconstruction relevant. Like, we'll get into it, but the Watson part of this bothers me too,
Sure. Sure.
and things
Some of
like
it.
that makes me question your deconstruction, whether or not it's actually Sherlock Holmes and not Sherlock Sholmes that you're doing this to.
Right. Well, and that brings up a good point. Is that one thing this movie also helps to indicate, which I think we saw the first part of this argument last week, and we're seeing the second part this week, is that Sherlock Holmes is also on some level actually irreducible from his supporting cast. Um, if you take the supporting cast away from Sherlock Holmes, is he still the same character? And so I think the intent of this argument is, in a way, you're right. He's not, and the movie shows his decline because he no longer has a supporting. He tries to build a new supporting cast around him to, let's say, extremely mixed success. But frankly, he fails as a character, and literally. But I could argue that might be kind of the point. But I think it shows. I think these two movies together show the point that Robert Downey Jr.'s version of Holmes would be far weaker if he did not have a relatively strong. Even though we gave that supporting cast some stick, he would have been weaker if he didn't have a supporting cast in place.
Yes. Well, we also said that the movie would be elevated if there were different, at least one different actor in one of those roles. It never came back to RDJ, and we never diminished the value of them as characters, just some of the actors they chose to portray those characters.
Right, and actually, we even argued that maybe there's a little too much supporting cast there. Maybe they could have done with at least got rid of Irene Adler. But still, Holmes and Lestrade's, at least, were clearly needed there to kind of balance that. And the fact that Lestrade and Holmes had bigger than normal roles than we've seen in the media thus far, again, weirdly, we keep going back to this, except for maybe the 50s show. The Ron Howard one keeps being a touchstone of how to do it right. I don't know why. I never expected that. But it's true. They also had a really strong supporting cast, whereas we noticed that through the other media, the role of Watson and Lestrade slowly grew over time to where it hit that kind of peak here. Now we're seeing the opposite point of that argument, which is we pull that away, Holmes looks extremely different. Whether it's fundamentally different, I think we're now moving into personal preference. And I'm happy I'd love to kind of untangle this with you because I think it's going to be a great conversation. But I think we're both in agreement that this is a very different Sherlock Holmes. It's just the argument of whether he completely fails as a character from the start or whether he fails throughout the course of the movie is perhaps the part that's open for debate.
I think so. We might touch on it if we get into the story proper. Is there anything else you want to cover from the background of the movie, or in case people are curious, like who the hell Sir Ian McKellen is, or
If you don't know who Ian McKellen is, I'm sorry, man. I don't know what to do. He's Magneto, obviously. Sorry, is he Magneto or Magneto? He's fucking Magneto. The only other thing I will say is that this is a movie that has a lot of flashbacks, and part of the way the story is told is through asynchronous storytelling, where the characters know more information than the audience lets on, and so part of the tension of the story is that we are learning as we go on. That's going to be a nightmare to try to untangle, so I'm going to go through each subplot kind of in a chunk, because that's I think the only way we can go through this movie with any kind of sanity.
what? Yeah, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah. Like, as I was doing this, I was like, oh my god, if we ever cover Memento, I have no idea how we'll talk about Memento.
And for people, since as you know that I have a different name every single time we do these, I don't know if Eddie looked at my name this week.
I did.
But for those of you that care, the name that I've chosen specifically for this movie that Eddie made me watch is Roger and Me. Please, Eddie, the floor is yours.
Right. So, in 1947, the long-retired Sherlock Holmes lives in a rural Sussex farmhouse with his widowed housekeeper, Mrs. Monroe, and her younger son, Roger, hence the name. Having just returned from a trip to Hiroshima, Holmes starts to use a prickly ash plant he acquired there to try to improve his failing memory. Unhappy about Watson's fictionalization of his last case, The Adventure of the Dove Grey Glove, he hopes to write his own account, but has trouble recalling the events. As Holmes spends time with Roger, showing him how to take care of the bees in the farmhouse's apiary, he comes to appreciate Roger's curiosity and intelligence and develops a paternal liking for him. So we're going to stop there. That's the first, honestly, 20 minutes of the film, actually. And what were your thoughts about this part of the movie, Chris?
I myself am curious why you would name your plant Prickly Ash. Is that not what your first thought were? So this automatically put me off on the movie.
Okay.
Just to start. To jump to 47, seeing, because a lot of the Holmesian stuff that we watched is not shown this part of Holmes' life, however we've already touched on.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And to start here, set a tone for the movie, a tone that I didn't know if I wanted to watch on my random 2 nights before we do recording of the podcast, because that's how my week has been. And I didn't like it. I didn't like the setup. Something about it just bothered me intrinsically.
Mm-hmm.
There, I could go. Go ahead.
Sure. No. So I will say that I didn't have necessarily any issues with it, but I recognize that some of this comes from my deeper knowledge of the canon, and also I've read the novel, which adds some context to it. So like Holmes being unhappy with Watson's how he tells his stories, that's actually based in the canon, although not a ton of evidence. There's a couple of references where he derides Watson, and then at one point in time, Holmes writes his own account of a case, and says, I can do this better than Watson can, and by the end recognizes he's not very good at it. So there's some canonical parts of this. Him living in Sussex by himself, raising bees, is kind of here, right? Like he does live by himself and raise bees at the end, or sorry, right before middle of, I don't remember exactly when, World War One. His last vow, he gets hired by the British government to beat up a German spy. That's his last vow. It's actually quite fun.
As we all should be.
Right, but it's not an espionage. Sorry, it's not a mystery story whatsoever. It's purely James or Sherlock Holmes is James Bond, right? It's wonderful fun, but very very different story than you're used to. So this is he's actually moved in now with. It looks like it's a new farmhouse, but he's now living with a housekeeper and her son. Um, and it's clearly a conceit of the story structure, right? Like it's the he needs people to bounce off of, so we have to introduce new characters to make that happen. Uh, and the idea is we don't know entirely what's going on, so we're uncovering what's happening along the same time as Roger. Roger's kind of actually our viewpoint character, which is a bait and switch when the movie's called Mr. Holmes.
Now, I want to, in case people have been listening to all the multiple seasons of this podcast, I want to point people towards, I think it's a season 3 episode where we think season 3, maybe episode 11, where
Wow.
we delve into Arrow and Chris's love of flashbacks.
Oh yeah, I
And
probably should have warned you, shouldn't I?
that is still pertinent to this movie.
Right.
I am not a fan of constant flashbacks for things. I like I'm not even like a certain style of story. I want the flashbacks to be. I'm not going to say these flashbacks aren't relevant to the movie, but they are telling the story in a way that I don't like my mystery movies to do. It's a thing where they don't give you enough clues to be able to solve the mystery before you hit the end. And in the end, they say, aha, we never showed you page 18 of this book that he referenced once at the beginning of the movie by a different title that you didn't see.
Right.
And that's what this
And
movie does with flashbacks.
well, we're not quite there yet, so I won't go too much into flashbacks. But I do want to point out that the big bait and switch that's happening here, frankly, is that there's two big twists, as it were. The first is we're led to believe that we're going to see, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, Sherlock Holmes' last case and why he retired, and that's the mystery of the movie. No, the first big twist, which is a pretty obvious one, is that the mystery is Holmes himself. He's losing his memory. So what does he need to remember, and how does that impact? So again, Memento is why I was on my head, because Memento is kind of roughly the same structure. Is what happens when you start to remember things, and how does that reframe what you just did? And then the other twist, which is less obvious but also weaker as a result, is that neither of those mysteries matter. Which is a bit of a problem with how this movie ends, and I will argue the ending is rough. Um, but certainly from here, where what's interesting about this movie is that it doesn't really apologize for how it starts, and I certainly respect that, while recognizing that the average viewer probably was extremely frustrated by this movie, because it's not until 20 minutes in you start to get something that remotely looks like a traditional Sherlock Holmes case. And this movie just says, oh, you know that Sherlock Holmes retired after he and raised bees, and so you know this stuff, so we don't have to explain it to you. It's like maybe you kind of didn't explain it a little bit more.
And as someone that actually knows a lot of the canon, I knew all this, but I
Right.
didn't like the way it was told. I will say, though, that it is beautifully shot, and Ian McKellen is acting off every piece of the screen. I have a lot of compliments that I can give for the acting, how the movie was shot, how the story is presented, if not the story itself.
Right.
So I will not lie. It is a very well-made movie, but it is not a very well-made movie for me.
Fair enough. I do wonder if the movie had started with Holmes hitting the end of his case, choosing to retire, and then we go to flash forward to him retirement. If that little bit may have changed the whole tenor of the movie.
I think that it would have made it easier for people to get on board with, but I don't think it would hold true to the vision that this person had to tell this specific story.
Right. Yes, fair. So anyway, about the 1947 initial frame. Do you have any other comments about that?
That is some of my favorite time frame to write in. Because you've got the impacts of the war that just happened, the lives that it destroyed, the history that's associated with it. You've got different parties that are forced to sort of work together globally, and how that changes and how a lot of opportunities that people died for were squandered and wasted. So
Mm-hmm.
you've got all that rich backdrop, then you get to layer another story into. So it's
Yeah.
like, and for game designers and people looking to write scenarios, I would really recommend like writing something from the 1947 to like really mid 1950s. Beautiful time frame.
Yeah. Digression, but I've actually been listening to an audiobook series that's largely set in 1950 London, although it bounces around a lot. And it's been interesting to kind of hear about that kind of rebuilding era, which I don't know much
Yeah.
about of London, and how things like the black market and whatnot didn't go away after the war was over,
Mm-mm.
and
Nope.
so there was a lot of the stuff that we needed to stay alive in 47 is now super awkward and need to get rid of in 50. It's an interesting timeline.
And if you're someone that's looking to create things during this time period, know that there is a bunch of resources. It is well researched. There are books about it, so you don't need to know everything. You can easily find it. And the amount of photographs and everything that was taken at the time is greatly
Oh yeah,
magnified during this period versus it was like 10, 20 years beforehand.
yeah.
And
Hmm.
still, a lot of those you can probably find at museums. Some of them may be copyright free. Who would have thought this podcast, Chris, gets very serious and talks about how to design games and like get good material for
I'm
your game book?
shocked. I
What
tell
can
you.
I say?
So, okay.
As a side note, just for this movie, if you haven't written a Sherlock Holmes RPG, you could do a Sherlock Holmes RPG set right here around Holmes being a beekeeper. I wouldn't buy it, but I'm sure someone would.
I would love a click adventure, video game where it's just click B, add B to beehive, get stung. Yell at kid.
All right, so you asked me a lot about this. We're gonna take an extra moment.
Okay.
Did this strike you and engage you as someone that has like a deep knowledge? You know the books, you know all the canon. Were you hooked?
Yes, initially I was. I was surprised at first because like it takes a while for you to realize it's 47. You see a lot of countryside, and it's done in such a way that it's a little slightly poorer rural farmhouse. So it's like, when is this thing? And it's not until he sees a doctor about his memory problems that you see a journal and says that has pretty clearly 1947 across. It's like, oh, okay, that's the time period we're in. And it's also that kind of movie. It's going to be very slow in giving you information over the course of time. Um, so I was a bit surprised they went that far out, and I think they did for a very specific reason that I'm not entirely sure it was worth it, and maybe even slightly tasteless, which I'll get to when we get there.
Okay.
Uh, uh, I feel like this largely could have been told in a post World War One scenario, and kept a lot of the same spine with very little change.
Hmm. Interesting.
Uh, but um, but having Holmes be extremely elderly and outliving all of his friends, and as someone who's so known for his mastery of his mental processes to start losing them, I think it's a very compelling and interesting area for drama.
Okay. Before we move on, what did you think of Roger?
Roger was an annoying twat. Hey, tell me a story. Hey, I broke into your room, read the thing. Isn't that cool? Hey. I mean, I know that's the point. The point is that Holmes needs to be irritated by the child before he grows to have affection for the child, but
Yeah.
they really leaned hard on the irritating part at the start.
Okay.
Speaking of, Over time, Roger's prodding helps Holmes remember the case, which is shown in flashbacks, which Chris hates. He knows that he must have failed somehow because it resulted in his retirement from detective business, but doesn't remember exactly the details of the case. We find out that almost 30 years earlier, after the First World War had ended and Watson had married and left Baker Street, Thomas Kelmett approached Holmes to find out why his wife Anne had become estranged from him after suffering 2 miscarriages. Holmes followed Anne around London and observed her seemingly prepared to murder her husband, forging checks in her husband's name and cashing them, confirming details of his will, buying poison, paying a man, and checking train schedules. Holmes, however, deduced her true intentions to have gravestones made for her and her miscarried children. The man she paid was actually turned to be a stonemason, and then kill herself afterwards. Confronting her, Holmes confessed he had the same feelings of loneliness and isolation, but his intellectual pursuits sufficed for him. Anne asked Holmes if they could share the burden of their loneliness together. Holmes is tempted, but instead advised her to return to her husband. She poured the poison on the ground, thanked Holmes, and departed. Holmes later learned that Anne succeeded in killing herself by stepping in front of an oncoming train. Blaming himself, he retired and fell into a deep depression. Watson briefly returns to care for him and, discovering details of the case, rewrites the tragedy into success. So you
That's a lot of
you had
movie right
concern.
there.
Yeah, it's a lot of movie, and you had concerns about Watson.
Where would you like to start?
The fact he's not in this movie.
We don't even know the actor that played him. I think, in fact, it was Ian Holmes in a Watson costume that just walked around the apartment, so they didn't have to pay another actor. If anything,
Probably.
they paid Sir Ian McKellen 2 salaries to be Watson and Holmes.
I figured it was just like some studio hand. I'd say, I'll throw a card on.
All right. Well, since we're on Watson, when did Watson die in the canon? Like, I know a lot of the Sherlock Holmes stuff, but I don't know specific like dates or time frames how you do for it.
Right. So again, because of the nature of the framing device, it's impossible to tell when Watson died because Watson was writing the stories. So obviously he's not going to write his own death date. I don't remember off the top of my head the actual year that Baring Gould puts him to death, but I know it is before Holmes. So that is at least consistent. And one slightly confusing part is that Holmes picks up a book that Watson wrote, which is this case, and he's angry with how the case was portrayed by Watson, so he wants to write his version of the case. Even though it's the case that obviously was never written in the original canon. Watson repeatedly referenced that he had a number of stories in a trunk at a bank that would be released upon his death, which is where we start getting to the weird Watson died thing. I don't think he would have had them self-published and beautifully bound to be put into a trunk. That seemed weird. But there is some evidence that Watson wrote a bunch of cases that we did not see, which has been the launching point for so many spin-offs and fan fiction writers to say, oh, this is an undiscovered case that Watson put in his trunk.
Okay. Because if this happens essentially after World War One, I'm plotting out the timeline because if your movie hasn't caught me, I'm thinking about the specific dates that you're giving me.
Right.
And it's like 30 years ago, and it says almost immediately after World War One ended in 1918. And we know that Watson came to Holmes after the case, stayed with him for a month, and Holmes says that he and Watson never spoke again because they were estranged, and 3 years later he died. So Watson's dead by 1921.
Right.
And so I'm trying to get a sense of if that's when Watson really died, because I didn't remember off the top of my head. It felt too soon. That would also mean that Watson was married for like no time, and I feel bad for his widow right there.
Right. And here's where one of the parts where I feel like studying after World War One would solve a lot of problems, because his last bow is set at the beginning or inside of World War One, because he's sent to track down a German spy, and from context clues of the story, it is very much, this is Germany under the Kaiser, not Germany under Nazis. So Holmes was retired and came out of retirement for that case before World War One. This is the case that's, as we said, in the retirement, which is very clearly set after World War One.
That's what I thought.
Now, one thing that's kind of skipped over is that, and this is one of the things where it irritates me slightly, is that Holmes says Watson lied about some aspects of their life. Like, this isn't actually, we didn't actually live at 221 Baker Street, we lived across the street, right? And that little bit is carrying a lot of weight for some of the changes that happen in this movie. It's like, oh, well, Watson just, Last Bow was written at a different time, and he disguised the nature of the case. And Watson lying about things in the text is not an uncommon tactic to try to explain things, but it is also lazy, frankly.
Yeah. And that goes back to part of my thing about if you're going to deconstruct a character, then you deconstruct the character without destroying the context that we know around it, because then that makes your deconstruction, we'll say, be generous and say,
Right.
Because you can't deconstruct something if you take the context of it and say all that context is wrong. This is the deconstruction of it. There's nothing that states, nothing to bounce that deconstruction off of. This is where I get that this could be any character now that you've made a detective.
Right.
And I have a lot of, you can tell I have a lot of issues with this movie.
Sure, yeah.
But I do not, I don't hate the movie how I hated Southern Cross. But I did not engage with it because it wants to do something and tell a story, but it's not being true to the origins that it came from to do the deconstruction.
No, totally.
Endless.
And I mean, I can see the artistic choice of saying Holmes and Watson's relationship is so well established in pop culture that we can take it as read. And that by having Watson visibly removed from the movie, we are establishing that Holmes's memory is also fragmentary because he's forgetting like what Watson looks like, right? I can see the aesthetic choice that comes with. I can see why an artist would come to that decision. And it's not even, I'll even go so far as to say I don't think it's necessarily a bad choice. I think it's one choice too far. I think it's one, and it's one of my problems with this movie is that there's lots of little things that like you did this because you thought it was cool, and it's not really tying to everything else, right? If there was even a line that says, "Oh my God, I don't even remember what Watson looks like anymore," something.
Yeah.
I think that would have helped. Oh, that's why we don't see Watson, because Holmes doesn't remember what Watson looks like.
You've used a word that I was looking for that I can't believe didn't come to me. It's lazy, and I don't like lazy. And if you're listening to this podcast, you know that I'm if you haven't deduced, I'm a TTRPG writer. There's a lot of historical work and research. Right. I am the exact opposite of this movie. I believe there should be context given. There shouldn't be an assumption made because your assumption could be wrong. Sorry.
Right.
Like a lot of our assumptions could be wrong if you don't have information to base things off of and engage with. So that is essential in any media. And some media, you can do it quickly with like a couple lines here or there. Sometimes you write an 800-page RPG book that has a lot of historical information for people to know stuff.
What? But who would do that?
To not do it and say that you already know that is a lazy choice. And I don't like lazy.
Now, I will say, not necessarily in defense of this movie, but we have not, on this podcast, I don't think we've ever covered an actual straight-up drama. We've done soap opera, we've gone close to this, we've actually covered drama, and one of the conceits of drama as a genre is when it's pure this kind of personal drama, is there's the whole acting and writing choice is that a lot of times people don't say what they mean, and the intent is that you're supposed to read between the gaps of the dialogue to see what's really happening with the characters. And as a dramatic choice, obviously, as a genre choice, obviously that's fine. There's been millions of dramas, and they'll continue to make sense. And there's times where I even enjoy that. When you wed it with the mystery genre, where the whole point of the genre is to explain things to the audience, even if that's the end, we run into awkward moments at the end of this case where we are being told through flashbacks, this is a mystery, and at the end we'll have the mystery solved. But also, it's a personal arc, and so therefore the logical conclusion is the personal arc will also be explained and solved. And again, I think the point is that this woman acting from Holmes' perspective irrationally, and him realizing that he didn't understand the emotional underpinnings this woman was going through, and therefore he failed her, is valid. But there's this bit in the middle where he's confronting her, that scene where they're sitting on the bench and talking, where there's just too much information missing. Because it's the, maybe we could share our lease together. No, I can't do that. And then she pours the poison out and then throws herself in front of a train. It's like, what happened there, right? It's the, what do you mean by spending a lease together? Are you talking about marrying me? You're already married. That can't be it. Are you talking about we kill each other? Which it seems to be the implication is that they both commit suicide. And Holmes goes, no, go back to your husband. It'll be fine. Which
It's
is a Holmes move.
it's interesting that you thought that she meant suicide. I took it as if they would move away together.
Right. Yes, it could be either of those, right?
Because his thing is, because his comment before that was, um, it's difficult unless people give you space to like engage with your intelligence or something like that. Acknowledging that she is intelligent, but she's a woman in their society. Look, you can read the context I'm doing right now. How she's a woman in their society, her intelligence will always be looked down upon. But if there was somewhere she could go, that'd be different. And that's when she says, and we could go away together, equivalently to be alone.
Right.
Like they could be intelligent somewhere off in a cabin reading books.
Right. See,
But
I interpreted we can go away as in we could just end it. You know? But again, and a good drama invites exactly this kind of conversation, right? Similar to the why did she pour the poison out and throw herself in front of the train? It's like I saw that that was performative. No, Mr. Holmes, I'm totally not going to kill myself. You've completely convinced me. And then she does what she wanted to do anyway. And that's what Holmes says this failure is that she lied to him and he didn't see the lie. But that's on top of the frankly two other subplots that we have there. Also Holmes's emotional arc, and also that we're seeing all three of these emotional arcs out of order means that if that case was a straight movie, that would have been fine. That scene would have been just fine. But because it's so disjointed by design, again, I understand that's just a choice. I feel like there need to be a little more work in each of those individual moments to make sure that we were still following the threads.
I agree with you, but I don't want to leave the case quite yet, because one of the things that I think I've expressed during the course of this Holmesian journey of ours is that I like a more emotionally intelligent Holmes. And we got that with Plummer to some extent. We got a little bit of it with Howard, a smidge with Howard.
Yep.
Like how Howard came back into that. And then they totally lose that track sometime after that.
Yep.
And the thing is, that is part of Holmes's journey. Holmes starts as this very logical machine. That's where we get Watson come in, and Watson is our point of view. He helps humanizes Holmes, and they've been together for a long time, him and Watson. And by having him not able to be emotionally intelligent, destroys the relationship with Watson. Like gone. Watson had no impact on this person. And also having her be able to outwit Holmes, thereby also undercuts Adler, who we all know that I love Adler, to have another woman outsmart Holmes.
Right, and I mean, I would even argue that Jeremy Brett has some of that emotional intelligence. But you're absolutely right. The arc is that Holmes gets less emotionally intelligent after the 20th century, and I hate to tell you, that downward trajectory is going to continue as we go on through this. Spoiler alert. Because the easy answer is that Watson's the emotional intelligence and Holmes is the logical intelligence, as an easy and not entirely incorrect way to balance those two characters dramatically, right?
And
Sherlock does it. Elementary absolutely does it. But I won't say Sherlock does this, but Elementary over time exactly has that arc. Holmes becomes emotionally intelligent. And also Elementary, in its defense, starts with Holmes as a recovering addict. And so his emotional journey pairs with his addiction recovery journey. So there's a level there which I always have personally enjoyed. But you're right. Most every other media from, I mean, it happens in other media before this, but generally speaking, the consistent view of Holmes from 2000 on is Holmes basically is emotionless, and that is just inconsistent with the canon.
And the thing is, the reason I like Holmesian stories so much as some of the variants is that it dealt with Holmes being there and Watson being there, and the two of them doing this thing together, and they rub off on each other, and they pick up. Holmes picks up more emotional intelligence. Watson picks up more of Holmes' sort of keen deductional sense.
Right.
And so you have them evolve into peers, and that thing that they've acquired would be part of their character because they've been together so long. So even if Watson goes and gets married, Holmes should still have those traits from Watson, and Watson still have those traits from Holmes.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
this movie does away with it without giving it proper explanation, which then goes back, for me, the deconstruction doesn't work. I've said it multiple times, so I'm not going to say it again, but blah.
But that does remind me, in this set of flashbacks, we also have the most obvious deconstruction, which I have a strong fondness for, admittedly, which is when Holmes is trying to remember the case. Actually, no, I'm sorry, it's not in this section. My apologies. It's later on. I'll get back to that. Put a pin in that.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we should definitely need to cover here, because this is a large part of the movie, actually.
Right. And to be honest, also, there's a lot of backwards and forwards. Like you'll see a chunk of it, and then he'll forget, and then we go to the 1947 spine. We come back, and we see that chunk, and see it again. So like it's a lot of space, but also it's a lot of repetitious space again because of the nature of the structure of the movie.
One part I did love, as I've given the movie a lot of stick, I loved Holmes seeing himself in a movie theater and having problems with it.
Okay, so that's what you was
That
going to reference.
I loved
That's what I was going to reference. But since we're here now, I'll go back to what I was going to say then. Yeah, that was the most deconstruction part of it. Is Holmes going to see a movie about the case he's trying to remember, and so he goes to see, although never explicitly said, it's heavily implied to be a Basil Rathbone film.
Yep.
He hates it. Even funnier is the guy playing Basil Rathbone playing Sherlock Holmes is Nicholas Rowe, who played young Sherlock Holmes in 1985 movie Young Sherlock Holmes. So it's Nicholas Rowe, who played Sherlock Holmes, playing Basil Rathbone, who's playing Sherlock Holmes, and Ian McKellen playing Sherlock Holmes, watching Nicholas Rowe playing Basil Rathbone, playing Sherlock Holmes. It is the most explicitly deconstructionist part of the movie.
I didn't know that's where you're going to go.
All Sherlock Holmes media and going, this sucks.
I didn't know that was where you're going to go, but that I had to comment on before we left here because that was like peak beautiful. That
yes.
was my favorite part of this whole movie.
Yes. And there are there's more deconstruction actually happens in another set of flashbacks, because we're kind of here compiling it. There's a lot of him going, oh, I never wrote Deerstalker. No, I never wrote 2-1-B. There's a lot of Ian McKellen saying things of Holmes that are meant to kind of break down the mythos of Sherlock Holmes. And again, this thread started with the movie we talked about last week. The breaking the Holmes mythos down to being the core of what Holmes actually is starts with, okay, at its core, it's the Adventure Center. Now let's take the character and break the character down even further and show you, here's the core of the character here. We're disagreeing on how successful that was, but the point is that's what this movie's trying to do. It's like, here's the core of Sherlock Holmes. This is a character. And the answer is not much. Whether it's good or bad, up to everybody's opinion. And that trend's going to continue throughout the rest of the decade, or until now, I should say.
I want to highlight everything that I did like. One of the things that I also noted almost immediately is our first image of Holmes taking the case is Holmes is in the coolest velvet green smoking jacket.
Yeah.
And I want to point out that it's green because if you know comics, green is like one of the colors that you frequently give villains for various reasons.
Yep.
But to have Holmes in that green thing and then for Holmes to effectively be the villain of the case was a nice touch. I don't know if it was intentional. I'm going to assume it was intentional.
Oh, that's interesting. I just kept looking at that going, I just kept saying it going, the third Doctor wants his jacket back, but...
No. Green, villain.
That's
Holmes
good,
is technically the villain of the case.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. I hadn't thought about that. That's actually a nice touch.
What can I say? I noticed things. I
Okay, so
drink and
anything
I
else
know the
about
six.
drinking those things? Anything else about Holmes's final case?
Uh, I could do a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm good. You know what? I'm not good. If we've established the last bow was his actual last case, he went into retirement, but this movie is portraying him as still actively working and looking for cases even after Watson had left. Last rant. I'm
Okay.
done.
Okay.
Also,
No.
how old is Miss Hudson?
Well, there's that too. Okay. Okay.
I
Actually,
think
no.
she's
This
a Highlander, by the way, because
there.
Miss
Okay.
Hudson was old when they were young, and Holmes is old here, and Miss Hudson is still kicking it. She's fucking immortal. She probably killed Connor McLeod. Done.
God damn it.
Yeah,
Okay.
case
There's
solved.
two separate things I need to address now. God damn it, Chris. So the first is that the timeline doesn't line up, but historically, Watson getting married, Holmes continuing to do cases by himself is supported by the canon. Watson gets married twice throughout the canon, at least twice. It's a little vague.
Watson. Dun, 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 dun.
But there are several canonical cases where Watson's at home trying to be a doctor, and he gets dragged to a case by Holmes, and his wife is bemused / disapproving about it. So that's more or less supported. The Mrs. Hudson thing. This is fascinating. Do you want to know what age Mrs. Hudson is in the canon?
4,000.
It is not mentioned anywhere. Her age, her appearance, never mentioned. It
Then
is entirely possible that Mrs. Hudson was 20.
why is she always portrayed as an older woman then?
Because that's how she was drawn in the original magazine. And everyone, same thing as Deerstalker. Everyone assumes Sherlock Holmes Deerstalker because it's never mentioned in the story separate Hounds of the Baskervilles. But Sidney Paget drew him with the Deerstalker, and he's had it ever since. So it's just because of how the magazine was illustrated.
It's all right. Then I'll let that one go. I still stand by that she killed Connor McLeod. Go ahead.
Fair enough. I'm just saying Sherlock Hound has a young Mrs. Hudson, and Sherlock Hound, as far as I'm concerned, is canon. Anyway, a second series of flashbacks recounts Holmes's recent trip to Japan, where he met a supposed admirer named Tamiki Umezaki, who told him the benefits of prickly ash. In fact, Umezaki brought Holmes to Japan in order to confront him. Years before, Umezaki's father had gone to England on business and never returned. He had sent a letter explaining that Holmes had persuaded him to remain there and forget his family in Japan. To Umezaki's disappointment, Holmes told him bluntly his father probably just wanted a new life for himself and that he never met the man. Stop there. So, good news, bad news. The good news is, relatively inclusive addition to the material. Actually hired Japanese actors. They filmed in Japan.
Yeah.
They had a relatively respectful presentation of Japan that was not heavily orientalized, which is great. But all of this was because they wanted to have Holmes look at Hiroshima victims. And they do nothing with this. Not a goddamn thing with this. And that's why I said this is the part I said is borderline tasteless. Because it really comes across on screen like it's basically horror tourism.
So I'm in agreement. And additionally, is it not also insulting that you have Holmes travel to the east to acquire some sort of mystical cure for something?
I will say mildly in the movie's defense that it does later appear that the prickly ash does nothing, and the person
That
who told him it did something lied. But
I'm
so I mean, there's a bit of let's get the gullible British guy to come over here by selling him some Oriental medicine, quote unquote. But I agree the film does not stick that landing hard enough to make that clear.
and I'm really curious whose name he has written on his left sleeve. We've seen like the one with the names of like Roger and the gentleman that brought him over. Who's on the other sleeve? Like, does he write names over here too? I'm also showing Eddie my arms as I point to
Yes,
places
because that
where
really
if I
helps.
had shirts, I would write names.
I will say, writing on a shirt sleeve again, canonically supported. But now here's the weird bit, and I'm going to go into the history of fashion here. Um, the reason why he did that was because in Victorian times, sleeves were disposable. You would replace your collar and your cuffs with, like, I think it was card, and you rotate them out every couple of days. So writing on it was basically writing on a sheet of paper, just happened to be at the end of your arm, which is the whole point of writing on your shirt sleeve, is because, okay, it's a convenient piece of paper, effectively. Him doing that on 47 clothing feels like here's an old habit I have, but it does, without that context, it looks super fucking weird. I agree.
And I know you said in Victorian time that was true.
Yes.
I don't think that was true in 47.
No, it wasn't. Absolutely not. So again, I think Holmes got into the habit of doing it when he was a younger man, and he does it now as an older man because of what he used to do. But it's really hard to write on cotton, you know.
And how does he know that is a person whose name is on his shirt? Like, I have so many little questions associated with it throughout the thing. And does that mean that when he's back home, does he write Roger's name on every shirt every single day? What about poor Miss Monroe? Does he not write her name on anything? We know he doesn't refer to her by name, I don't think, throughout the entire thing.
Right.
No, I don't think he does at all. He just speaks and she
Yeah.
responds.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. At one point, he calls her Mrs. Hudson, actually, which again I think is intentional.
So I have a lot of little quibbles, but no, I want to stay on the Japan piece for a bit.
Yeah.
It's now you're in mind. You said it. I feel blah about the whole thing.
Right. Like, and again, like, this is the case. Like, if you moved it back a couple decades, you can still visit Japan, and you can still show a relatively modern Japan in the 2020s. You don't need to have walk by Hiroshima victims. Everything in the story still works, right?
And linger on them at that too.
Right. Yeah. It atrocity porn. That was the phrase I was trying to find earlier. It's really what it feels like, because again, if there was some connection to this horrible thing happened to Japan and how it relates to Holmes's emotional journey, I could see the justification for this, but just nothing. Not even an attempt to try to connect those things. It's just, by the way, remember this horrible thing that happened in Japan?
Or if
Yeah,
it
I'm pretty
related
sure Japan
directly,
remembers it.
or if it related directly to Mr. Umazaki, it would then have relevance, but it doesn't. It doesn't relate to him. It doesn't relate to his mother. It doesn't relate to his father. Has no context for their story other than they're getting the ash from that one site.
Right. Now, like, I could see because it's heavily implied that Umazaki's father was a spy for the UK government. So if he somehow, his actions led to, or failure to act led to Hiroshima being bombed, I could see that connection, right? And then Holmes seeing the results of what happened because he allowed Umazaki's father to become a spy. I could see that connection, but I'm just making stuff up. That is a bold-faced thing I'm making up to try to connect these things together, because ultimately there's no connection.
That would not work either. I'm sorry.
I'm not saying it would work. I'm saying is I could see it happening. But the point is, it's not even that.
I think I would almost be more offended by that, because that would be a Japanese person that supposedly didn't do something, so that's why that happened to their
Fair. My point is that the whole thing is just gross, right? It just didn't need to be.
I know you're spitballing, trying to give the movie something, and
right.
Bah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
and my frustration is that, again, like, if you just take that part out and then shift it a couple decades, everything else for me more or less fine. Yes, I agree. The trope of the mystic medicine from the East that will solve everything. But again, I read that as Holmes being so desperate that he's willing to even try this. And again, like, he takes this stuff in the 1947 story, and his memory does not improve. So it's as far as the movie is concerned, it's just nonsense. He's grasping at straws. So the fact that it's not actually any better, it more or less works for me. Again, the movie doesn't stick landing on that. But so it's frustrating to have this relatively inclusive. Yeah, the characters don't have strong Japanese accents, like, chance to portray. And even when his father, it's kind of intermixed with all this, but there's a brief bit where his father's actually being recruited by Mycroft, and his father
That's at the end.
was at the end. Okay, sorry, skip over that.
We have the mother who actually speaks Japanese, which was nice to actually get to hear it in the
Yeah,
movie. But
the father has no trace of an accent. So there's an interesting kind of by choice of accents and language, you're seeing the dichotomy between those two characters and their son, how they're kind of torn between these two extremes. There's some interesting stuff there.
it does
That's
nothing with.
right, and that's the thing is like, oh, cool. So that's why last week you were like, obviously more inclusivity in Sherlock Holmes movies. It's like, well, kind of. But it's like, yes, but not this way. Right? It's like,
Ugh. So yeah, it's and the thing is, they wait for him to give him the book at the end with an autograph saying that you just bought my book, A Tale Comes from the Library. If he knew that when he picked up the book, there's no reason he would have stayed there to travel to get the prickly acid. He knows it wouldn't have worked because this person has not read his book, which means they don't know anything about the subject matter to help him.
I
There's
again
a
interpret that as Holmes being that desperate. I interpret as Holmes as being that desperate. But you're right. It's Holmes has a tendency to hold back his reveal for a dramatic moment. And there are times where if writers are not thinking through carefully when Holmes knows what and how that impacts his actions, does mean like Holmes does lead to points where Holmes makes obviously stupid choices just to be dramatic. And how much of that is writers not understanding Sherlock Holmes? How much of it is that Holmes is just a dramatic bitch? Is up to individual interpretation. I tend towards this is peak me for reference. There's a line, a frame from a Transformers comic, where a bunch of Autobots are talking, and Megatron says something off panel, and dramatically appropriate, and then oh my god, Megatron's here, and then next to him is Starscream going, yeah, I've been standing here for 10 minutes waiting for this moment before he could speak. And there are times where I think Sherlock Holmes like that. It's like, well, I can see Watson going, Holmes, let's just arrest the man. No. We have to get the right moment. It's like, he's right there, Holmes. Just arrest the man. No. I have to wait for him to be in the spotlight. I'm going to tackle him if you don't goddamn say something. I feel like there's elements of that. But again, in this chunk of the movie, that is me absolutely trying desperately to justify a subplot that had decent intentions, but just absolutely fails on a lot of fronts.
Yeah. So, I don't know.
Moving on. Unless you have anything else about this.
Nah, I'm done with
it. I'm done with it. Okay. In the present, which is 1947, Mrs. Monroe grows discontented with her work as Holmes becomes infirm and burdensome to look after. Her closeness to her son Roger is another source of tension, as the boy is becoming dissatisfied with his family's lowly status and increasingly distant from his barely literate mother. Mrs. Monroe accepts a job at a hotel in Portsmouth and plans to take Roger to work there as well. Roger is unenthused by the prospect of hotel drudgery and unwilling to leave Holmes, and says as much to his mother. Later, Holmes discovers Roger lying unconscious in the garden, covered in insect stings. As the boy is rushed to the hospital, Mrs. Monroe accuses Holmes of caring for nothing but himself and the bees, and prepares to burn the apiary. Holmes stops her, having realized the culprits are actually wasps. Roger was found nearby a nest and tried to flood it in order to protect the apiary, but the wasps swarmed on him instead. Holmes and Mrs. Monroe burn the nest together, then return to the hospital as Roger regains consciousness. As they sit in the waiting room, Holmes tells Mrs. Monroe that he was too fearful and selfish to open himself up to Anne Calmette to give her the comfort that she needed. He wants her and Roger to stay in his life and tells her that they will inherit his estate after his death. Back home, Holmes writes his first work of fiction, a letter to Umezaki telling him that his father was a brave, honorable man who worked secretly and effectively for the British Empire. As Roger begins to teach his mother how to care for the bees, Holmes emulates a tradition he saw practiced in Hiroshima, creating a ring of stones to serve as a place where he can recall the loved ones he has lost over the years. So, I guess that's technically true. The Hiroshima thing has one connection, which was the final scene of the movie, which didn't need to be there.
No, not at all.
Um, so again, I really like this movie. And
Were
the
you
ending, uh,
were you now a fan of Roger by this point in the movie? His journey.
generally, yes. Honestly, I actually kind of liked Roger at this point. Um, my frustration, and this is sometimes where I don't like this podcast in the sense of I like something and then I sit down and analyze it for this podcast and I realize the flaws and it makes me dislike the movie a bit more or the media a bit more. And this is one of those points because I realized after rewatching it, the reason why I like Roger is for the cheapest of reasons, which is that he almost died. Now he's better, and now I care for him more because he nearly died. Because Roger doesn't really change in
He
this
does.
movie.
He does change. He
He's an
gets
asshole to
worse.
Holmes. He goes from being an asshole to Holmes to being an asshole to his mother. That's
He
basically
gets
the short thing.
worse. He becomes
Well,
more of an asshole through the course of this movie and his engagement with Holmes.
right, right. Um, so I mean, I like him because he's siding with the character I like, and then he nearly dies, but then he's saved by the character I like, and so therefore I like him more. The transitive property of care, and it absolutely works in media. Don't get me wrong. This is a trick that works, and there's a reason
Yeah.
why it keeps popping up is because it fucking works, and it worked on me.
And I am too bitter and jaded to have it work on me.
I
To decide which is
have no
better
human
from our
emotions. I care
spectrums.
about people.
I'm too logical to understand human emotion and pain. Oh my god, I've become Sherlock Holmes. Um,
Burn down the apiary.
is that where you want to go? Eddie, if you have
No.
an apiary and you have already tossed gas on it, are your bees gonna be okay? That was
Especially
my thought.
the apiary is like 20 feet nearby.
She'd already put gas on it. She was literally about to strike a match when he shows up. I was thinking, are those bees okay covered in gas?
No, probably not. I mean, I'm not a
I'm
biologist. I don't know, but
joking aside then. It is good that the movie came up with this dramatic conclusion that it was building up to show Holmes caring about people. Mind you, this is a journey that Holmes did a bajillion years ago, and Watson already taught him this, and it was good to see it happen.
well, I mean, again, like I could see, and this is again once again me projecting the film, um, that he did learn this with Watson, and then Watson died, and so he backslid because people are constantly emotional, right? So as much as it would be nice to say, "Oh, I've learned this lesson in my life, and so I will never do this again." That's not true. We all backslide. I backslid personally in my life recently. And as soon as I sat down and figured out what the problem was, like, oh, I know this. I just forgot. So people do. It's our works in progress. That's just
But that's
sort
the
of human
difference.
nature. Right.
You said you backslid, then you understood that you did it. They have Holmes backslide without any understanding of that behavior occurring until
Right.
these two people come into his life and they teach him about love and humanity as if he hadn't experienced it before.
Right. And the other piece that I struggle with, and granted, some of this is I don't know how dementia works. It's implied that Holmes has a undisclosed medical condition, which is implied to be dementia, but it's never actually stated. So therefore, we have
Yes.
problems with what the actual symptoms are because you never know what the disease is. But assuming it is dementia, my understanding of it is that you don't forget strong emotional moments in your life. Uh, 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 you forget people's faces, you confuse people, but the past is very clear to dementia patients usually. And so if this is 30 years where this case happened, he probably would have remembered that case if he retired on it because it's so much a part of his life. And for him to walk away from that would have been a huge emotional moment in his past.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole conceit of I remembered what it was like to hurt somebody at the same time that in 1947 I hurt somebody, and so I'm able to tie those things together and change course on where these relationships are going. I get that how the dramatic structure works, but when you sit down and think about it, there are some pretty large gaps in there.
I think
And
we've
so,
already established what it is. It's lazy. There's work that should have been done that wasn't done that would have made it resonate more and been more powerful and have made everything feel cleaner.
right.
And if I did not have my genreless critical thinking cap on, and I just watched it as a drama movie, maybe I would have not have seen some of the stuff that I saw. I doubt it. I would have probably seen most of it, but it wouldn't have irritated me as much as it does watching it now, because I one of the things that I do love about the podcast, even if I don't love something that we watch, is that we discuss it and it makes me think about how this thing could have been better. And
Hmm.
it's not that I hate the movie. I see what the movie's trying to do, and I wish that it had done those things better.
Absolutely. And that's where I'm at, is the so moving into kind of wrap up anyway. Um, a lot of the reasons why I like this movie is just because it's trying to do something so different with Sherlock Holmes. It is a flawed attempt. I completely agree. There's only, as much as I love this movie, I have only watched it 3 times. And one of them was for this podcast. So it's not like it's a movie I constantly watch. I think I've actually watched the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movie more than I've watched Mr. Holmes. Um, because first of all, it's not a movie you throw and go, I want to have a good time. Let's watch this movie about Sherlock Holmes losing his mind and accidentally murdering bees. It's not lighthearted, right? This movie has to be in the mood for. Uh, so a lot of my love for it is, look at how far removed from the Holmes and Watson do buddy cop mysteries in Victorian times we can do with Holmes as a franchise, as a media, as a genre. Um, uh, so the fact that this kind of thing can exist is exciting. And the fact that Ian McKellen does a fantastic, you're right, the acting and the visuals are fantastic, is great. And, even, Sherlock Holmes goes to Japan is a sentence that fills me with dread, right? But even there, even though we gave a lot of stick to the Hiroshima part of it, a good chunk of that is still handled really, really well. Um, it's a nice balance of res- the movie trying to be respectful of the culture, while Holmes, as an older British man, maybe not respecting as well as he should. I liked a lot of that stuff. I like a lot of the bits of this movie. And when I'm not watching it with a critical eye, I can let those bits kind of just wash over me and generally be okay with lots of chunks of film. Although the Hiroshima thing always bugged me from day
Yeah.
one. I almost walked out the first time because I was like, ugh, I just powered through it. Like, oh, good, they didn't do anything with it, but they didn't do anything with it, you know. Um, but at the same time, I'm going to go back to something that you say a lot of, which is that this is 2015 now. People should be doing better at this stage,
Hmm.
and it, it's it's a it's flawed on some pretty fundamental levels. Because I don't think, because ultimately I think the team, they got the details right, but missed the entire point of it.
Yes. And for the breaking of it down, thinking of how it could have been better, even 3 additional movies could have probably fixed, in my opinion, fixed a lot of this movie's glaring errors and issues. Because you could have
Mhm.
used those, sprinkled those minutes throughout almost in 30-second blurbs, except for the Hiroshima bit, you need like a full minute at least there. Probably 15-second blurbs throughout to add context that's missing from scenes. Like 2 or 3 sentences here.
Yep.
Maybe Holmes says something here and says something there. And that would have tightened the script and the movie experience. And you can't rely on viewers knowing who Holmes is to make your movie work. At the end of the day, that's my entire bump of the movie.
That's an interesting. Because I'm with you, except for the very last sentence actually. Because like I think Sherlock Holmes is one of the few characters, a bit like Spider-Man and Batman, where you don't necessarily need to explain everything to have the audience largely buy in. But I will agree with you that this is a part of Holmes's life that is so largely unknown that you do need to do some. This would be like, let's use Batman Beyond as an example. Like, Bruce Wayne in his elderly age. You have to give a lot of context for why a retired Bruce Wayne is interesting in the context of Batman Beyond to make that work. Or Spider-Man Across the Multiverse. Like, you have to give a little more
Now,
context for.
Eddie, this is like Spider-Man Reign is what this is. If for anyone that doesn't know what Spider-Man Reign is,
Mhm.
do you know what Spider-Man Reign is
I
before
actually
I do
don't
this?
know. No, I
There you
actually
go.
don't.
So this Sherlock Holmes is like Spider-Man Reign. And Eddie looks at me blankly while I asked. It's when Spider-Man and his radioactive blood killed Mary Jane Watson, and that becomes the dark universe Spider-Man lives in. His blood is
Oh,
radioactive. His relationship with Mary Jane kills Mary Jane, and that's like the dark story arc. You know how many people know that? Like 12 of us.
right.
And that is what you're saying people should know about Holmes to tell your home story. It doesn't work.
Okay. No, that's fair. That's you're right. That's the better analogy. Is like, let's take this relatively obscure chunk of media and build off, because really you have to know one specific story from Sherlock Holmes, which was published damn near the ends of Doyle's timeline, uh, and it was the most cash grabbiest of the Holmes cash grab stories. So yeah, no, I agree with that. It's the There are other movies, and we'll talk about at least one of them, where or media, I should say, where you don't need to have Sherlock Holmes explained to you for the concept to work, but it has to be the pop culture understanding of Sherlock Holmes.
Correct. That we're
So, so
100% on. Like,
I agree with you in tone, which is that this is the era of Sherlock Holmes that you need to explain a bit more. I'm completely with you on that. But I don't think fundamentally saying no, we have to explain who Sherlock Holmes and Watson are and what they do. I don't think you have to at this point. You don't have to explain who Superman is, right? There are certain characters where you can kind of just do that, but it has to be specifically the pop culture consensus on that character. And if
he's
you
Marlon Brando's
deviate from
son.
that, you have to explain that.
He's Marlon Brando's son.
Superman's Parliament's son?
Yeah, because he's from Krypton.
Oh, God.
Absolute power.
Now I kind of want to watch Superman 2 again. Is that Superman 2? Yeah, it's 2.
Marlon Brando is technically only recorded for the first Superman movie, but they recorded enough of him so they could split him over two because they paid Marlon Brando the most money to be in that movie. And I think he's also the headliner if you look at the movie. Because Superman's
Oh,
from Krypton.
God. Much like how the first Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes film doesn't have Basil Rathbone as the headliner. Yeah.
Yeah.
See how I tie it all
So
together?
if people want us to do a Superman movie coverage and we can talk about Marlon Brando and Krypton, let us know.
Krypton. That's God. That's so era of like Optimus Prime pronouncing Teletran as Teletron. Teletron one. No.
All right, Eddie, back to this, so we can eventually wrap this up. What people don't know is we spent like an hour before the podcast just bullshitting. So, Eddie, would you recommend this movie to people, and if so, who? And why do you hate them?
I would recommend this to people. I know you. It's funny. Like, this actually weirdly one of the few things where we've been on different sides on and still haven't really changed our respective positions. But no, I actually would recommend this to people. But definitely, I agree that it has to be at the risk mindset, and you want to know what is the edge case of Sherlock Holmes. If you want to see, I mean, compare this to Sherlock Holmes and Leading Lady, right? If you want to see an elderly Sherlock Holmes, this is a very different take on elderly Sherlock Holmes. In a lot of ways, a better take. In a lot of ways, not at all the take you would want to have. So if you want to see Sherlock Holmes as a character, you want to see Sherlock Holmes as a character with an emotional arc. If you want to see Sherlock Holmes in a drama where the mystery is subordinate to the drama, then yeah, I think this is a great movie. I recognize that most people, when you say this is Sherlock Holmes films, don't want any of those things. And you probably don't want to watch this movie. Also, don't let your friends spring this movie on you without context, apparently, is the thing I've learned today.
It wouldn't have made any difference if you gave me context. I would have probably forgotten before I started to watch it.
Fair.
So, if people want to know what we're going to do next time, we're actually going to be covering our last Holmes movie. Not the last Holmes podcast, because we're going to cover one more movie, then we can do like a wrap up about Holmes, and we'll put Holmes to bed, maybe.
Question mark. The end?
But
Question mark.
next time, we're finally going to cover Enola Holmes to wrap up this trek through Holmesian lore.
Right.
as she is the
And
most canonical character that Doyle ever wrote.
you can't even say it with a straight face. No.
And you can find that on Netflix. It's going to be the first one, Enola Holmes 2020, I think.
Yeah. We're gonna cover the first one and the second one. And this is my argument will be this is now Sherlock Holmes as setting. Move from Sherlock
And
Holmes as character, Sherlock Holmes setting.
if people are curious, it has not Sir Witcher Gerald Henry Cavill as Holmes.
I have thoughts about Cavill's Holmes.
What? All right, we'll save that for next time.
So yeah, if people wanted to talk to you about Enola Holmes, Chris, where would they find you?
You could find me on Blue Sky as Darker Hue. You could come into the Discord and talk to me about the brilliance that is Enola Holmes. I'll tip my hand early that I like the movie. If you want to talk to me about Mr. Holmes, you could probably email Eddie and he'll respond to something positive.
Yes, if you want someone who liked the movie to defend it to you, you can find me on Pugsteady. That is my website, pugsteady.com. That's also where you can find me on Blue Sky. Or you can also find me on the Darker Hue website, where I am showing people my nice faux leather-bound deluxe copy of the Trigon manga that I purchased for myself as a gift. I'm very
It is
excited
very
about
cool.
it. So with that, we will be
Eddie?
slowly. Yes.
I do have one thing to say to you about you making me watch this movie.
I love how it's my episodes. I'm making you, but it's your episodes that you enjoy it. It's funny how that works out. But yes, tell me.
My last comment about you making me watch this movie, I feel very resigned. Call back.
Want more of this bullshit? Join us next week where we talk about Enola Holmes.